Get going in here. All right. So as we get started, um, folks in the back, keep going, all the way out. You got it. You're almost there. Um, who here within this room was at this talk previously at Esmeralda? Okay, nice. We got a fresh audience. Who here in this room, more than, let's say, 50% of your employment is writing code? So some degree of software developer, doesn't need to be all the time, okay? Um, who here in this room has used Cursor before? Okay, lots of folks. Who here in this room has used Claude Code, Codex, or some other CLI? Okay, nice. That is such a radically different answer than whenever we were together in Esmeralda 6 months ago. And it's really cool to see like that architecture shift. Let's see, so we'll do this little intro. So I'm Atin. I'm a senior software developer turned founder. I have a startup called Authentic. A lot of what we're going to be talking about today is how we've used large language models to really produce professional grade, production grade code. I think that there's a real opportunity here, that there's a lot of change in the space, and so many people, I appreciate that. Yeah, go for it. And a lot of people just didn't learn about this stuff, right? A lot of people learned how to do software development through traditional academic institutions and never had an opportunity to skill up and existing in a world where the tools chain is changing so fast, right? And one of the core takeaways here is like, if you think back to the software you were writing 3 months ago, if you were using the same stack and approach now that you were doing 3 months ago, you're doing it wrong, okay? And that's like a huge paradigm shift, but I'm very serious. If you're like, oh, I'm gonna do this project like I did the project before, that was a completely reasonable thing to do in 2020. It is a completely inappropriate decision architecturally in 2025. You should be continually evaluating your tool chain. And so hopefully this talk can just like embed some ideas for things that you can think about as you move into your next project. As you can tell, we're assuming some base knowledge here. This is not necessarily beginner class. I'm assuming you know what an IDE is, what Git is. I'm assuming you're working with code regularly. And if not, ChatGPT could probably explain to you in real time what these things are that I'm referencing. But the goal here is not to necessarily like one-shot an app. The goal here is to build production-grade code. And there's a major difference there. I also think that the latter is much less discussed. I think it's much less profitable to a certain extent, and so that's what we're going to get into. So first, we're going to just talk very quickly, just to get this people that didn't raise their hand for having used Cursor and having used a CLE, command line interface. These are two things that I've jumped back and forth on. When I gave this talk at Edge City Lana, I was using Cursor exclusively. Whenever I gave this talk at Edge City Esmeralda, I was using Claude Code almost exclusively. And as of 5 days ago, when Cursor 2.0 came out, now I'm moving back into IDE-driven development, and I would also strongly encourage you to be proficient and fluent in both tools so you can move in between them depending on what the strengths are. So very briefly, this is what Claude Code looks like. Let's bump the font size up here. It's a command line interface, right? It's acting in one directory. You're not looking at source code. You're interacting directly with this tool in a terminal, right? If you do this, I'm just gonna like dump a few. I should also add, at any point here you have questions or comments, I'm certainly welcome. This doesn't need to be like a preacher at a pulpit. I very much appreciate where other people are at. I'm sure that other people in this room have other ideas. I know that I'm going to say some things that Patrick is going to venomously object to. I know that other people in this room have different approaches. I'm always curious too. So a CLI is super handy in various things. This is a really good approach for a nice kind of linear way to interact with code. I use this a lot. Who here knows how to look at the tokens their Claude agent has used? Okay, we got 3 people. This is like, there's a lot of these little things. Claude Monitor is super cool. and I treat this like a video game. My goal is to get the highest score possible. This shows me how many tokens I've put out in Claude Code. So in the last month, I've gotten about, if I would have paid at API costs, I would have spent about $840. I'm paying for the $200 Claude Max plan. And so this is like a really fun way to gamify your own software development of like, you want this number to be big because this is like such a fun metric for like how much work I'm getting done in a given day, right? And it's pretty crazy, right? Like if we look at total output tokens in the last month, I've got like 3 million output tokens, right? Like that's a immense amount of code. I'm going to do a lab on Claude Code and Cursor 2 days from now on Thursday at this same time. So we're not going to get into like necessarily the nitty gritty of exactly how I use this here, but I just want to make sure that you're familiar with this. You're like understanding what this is if you didn't raise your hand. For the people that didn't raise your hand about Cursor, this is Cursor. This is a more, let's pull up some actual source code here to look at. This is an actual, what we would call an IDE. This is how all software used to get made back in the day. You've got a directory on this side, you've got a terminal down here, you've got your agent conversations over here, and you've got your actual code here. Let's see if I have, so like you can just click here and you can see, all right, all these green lines were just added by this agent. This really lets you be looking at the code regularly and is also has a lot of pros over the command line interface. Both of these tools are evolving really fast. Yeah. Yeah, thank you for saying. I mean, it looks particularly ugly now, but hopefully it's at least a little more readable. Let's go to full screen too. This is super handy because then this means that you're able to review on a line-by-line basis what code the agent is changing on the fly. I think this forces you to engage with a little more. I admit that whenever I'm in Claude Code land, it's easy for your brain to kind of turn off because you're just like, I need you to fix the bug on the invite screen, you know, and then like away you go. This actually leads into another critical thing. It does not matter if you are a senior software developer or a art history teacher, you should be talking to your computer. It is like, many of the things I'm going to talk about today are like very specific and professional. However, talking to your computer is not one of them. It doesn't matter. You could be in high school. You could be a postdoc. You could be Elon Musk. It doesn't matter. You should be talking to your computer. This is by far the fastest way to input tokens and prompt your machine. Right? This is called Super Whisper. It's $80 a year. There's a bunch of other programs out there. Pick your poison. You are going to prompt, like, this would have been very hard to write code with. No one was going to use like voice to text to write code, right? But the LLM becomes that bridge in between natural language and your source code. And so it doesn't matter if there's some ums or some likes. You don't need to say open curly bracket, you know, quotation mark, yada, yada. I can just speak exactly the prompt that I want into existence. And because it's so fast to input text here, I'm going to use more detail. And the more detail you put in the prompt, the better your output's going to be, right? So I just did option space, bam. And like, I bet that was absolutely perfect word for word from what I just said, right? I think it's, what is different? Oh yeah, you're right. Yeah, the last word there is different. But I think that like ultimately that's still going to be, and what's also cool is that you can, and even in that case, whenever something gets wrong, if you're writing code, that's an issue, right? But if you're running through an LLM, the LLM's like, oh, I get the gist of what you're saying. And oftentimes I'm not even correcting them. Oftentimes I'm not fixing typos. My goal is maximum throughput from me to the alien brain in in California. I want maximum throughput on that connection. And I would rather like fire off a bunch of queries than I would to like tightly refine the wording on each individual one. So that's some directory. Oh yeah, and then I think an important thing to think about, this is also, I think, a really underrated upgrade for a lot of projects. If you're working on something with a front end and a back end, the default is to open the given repo you're working in. However, what you can do with these is you can start thinking about the directory structure. So for me, we've got a front end and back end as part of Authentic. And I put both of these, I have our front end code here, our back end code here, and then I can open up this main repos folder in Claude and give it access to both of these repos. You think this is like basic, but a lot of people don't do this. This is super, super handy. I have a separate, who here knows what Claude.md or agents.md is? Okay, this should be 100. This is the single biggest upgrade to your prompt quality in my experience. Is they're synonymous, so these two things are the same thing. For the Linux nerds, I actually have Claude.md as a symlink to agents.md. One is the industry standard agents.md, and one is Claude.md that Claude Code uses. I'm not going to talk about the distinction there. What's going on is that this is your instructions for the agent. This gets tacked on to every query you send to the agent. This is the file you should be editing most in your entire project. This is where, if I make a 2% improvement in the performance of an agent by working here, that is a 2% improvement on every single prompt. And if I'm writing 200 prompts a day, that's like the force multiplication effect is huge. And in fact, then this also goes to all of your sub agents. So it actually gets into like an exponential situation. You should be very carefully editing and refining your agents.md all the time. Okay, once a week, something like this, right? You get done with a week of work, you think, okay, what patterns did I notice the agent doing? What problems are there? And this is an agent.md file that exists outside of this structure, and it says, hey, agent, you're existing on this top level structure. You have 2 projects. Here are their names. Here are what they do. We can bump this up. We use really strong language because like whenever we're running from this directory, this is the most important thing for the agent to know. It's critical. All of this is all about how to do this. And then this top 30 lines here that you're looking at is what exists for both in this kind of top level directory. And then we can get into, let's open up like our client side code. We can look at the actual document that we're using in the project itself. So this is giving the agent, every time I ask the agent something, these 500 or so lines are handing the agent the context it understands. When you're working with an agent, you want to think that you're like kind of dealing with like a savant in like 9th grade, right? So it's like he's a 9th grader, he comes in, he's unbelievably intelligent, but he only knows, or they only know, or it only knows, depending on your philosophical perspective on how to refer to agents, just about what it's been trained on. And so by handing it this file of agents.md, you're handing it all of this context that is going to deeply multiply whatever it was trained on and be able to give it an understanding. So first you see, we talk a little bit about what the app is. It's a social media app, ephemeral short-term photos. We talk about the technical stack. We talk about the development environment. This is really important, right? If you say the development environment, you're going to say, hey, I want you to be using Jest for testing, right? You're going to remove a lot of issues that people talk about on Twitter whenever they complain about agent-based or CLI-based prompting approaches by just handing these answers to it. And then it's going to use its tokens and its thinking tokens for questions that really matter, like where is the bug on the login screen, and not what's the framework that the login screen is using, how to think about it. Talk about core philosophy, some personality, naming conventions, like for us. And on a meta level, we're using agents.md to address common failure modes we're watching the agent hit repeatedly, right? So I noticed that follower count and following count, that confuses even engineers like humans. It certainly was confusing our agent regularly. The approach here is, okay, I noticed a failure mode. I saw this happen a couple times. I update our agents.md so all of our agents across our entire distributed team now very clearly understands the difference in between follower count, following count, and avoiding like various ambiguous other phrases, right? And that actually gets into something that's like really critical, is just when we're in this world of super fast changing tools, you need to be noting anything you're doing repeatedly and upgrading the agent so that you don't need to do that again, right? Anytime you feel like, oh, I've run this query before, oh, I always do these 7 steps whenever you run the build script. It used to be, you'd build like a bash script and it was like very tight and scripted and like certain, and one little command line would change and the whole bash script would fail. Now we can just be using slash commands. We can be using agents. We don't need to be doing these repeated tasks. And by making them automated, you also give the agent the ability to do it, right? So for example, on a build command, let's say you use 4 different commands to do your build, right? You maybe run your unit tests. We'll talk about that. You run your linter, you run an upload thing, you run a build script. You should be having that automated, and now Claude is going to say, oh, I know how to run this build. And so I can say, I want you to fix this bug, review it, and then run the build script all in one prompt. And now I'm able to be even more efficient, as kind of the orchestrator or the maestro. I don't think we need to go through this whole thing because we're going to, this actually leads nicely into the next thing, which is blueprint-driven development. Yeah, yeah. Totally.
Do you prefer when you have to make a script, like Bash script, shell script,
Yeah.
or non-deterministic, like agent,
Yeah.
agents MD?
Are you familiar with slash commands? Who here in the room has used a slash command before? Okay, that is also a super handy thing here, right? So let's look at one. So first to answer your question before I get into slash commands, I generally speaking prefer using a slash command, but obviously there are exceptions. We do have plenty of bash scripts in this project. I think it's like by default, I'm going to make it a agentic command of I'm going to tell the agent to do the following things. But if it's like really rigid, then I might go ahead and make it a bash command. The script, for example, to like increment our build number, I have that as a bash command. The script to do our build, which is a little bit more complicated, that involves the agent. Yeah. I mean, obviously, yeah. So I'll leave it at that. Let's talk about blueprint-driven development, and that's going to inform our slash command stuff. But we definitely want to get more people here familiar with slash commands because they're now like becoming an industry standard. Blueprint-driven development is something that actually is still in this talk from a year ago, which is like a testament in and of itself. Blueprint-driven development is a phrase that I use to talk about we're going to go to cursor. We're going to bring this to the front. Here we go. Hopefully that's still readable. Is writing out an extremely high level of technical documentation before you write the first line of code. So what I'm a fan of Agile, Agile Scrum Master, all that stuff. I'm all for iterative development and people over processes and all this kind of stuff. But when it comes to working with agents, you want to give them very clear understanding of what they want to build before you get into building it, right? A lot of what Lovable and Replit do is they really set up the agent to be doing this in the background for non-technical users. So what's going on here is you can see these markdown files. Markdown files are my, and Authentic as a company's, way to interact with large language models. All of our documents are markdown files, yeah. Yeah, totally. They're just separators for the humans. To make it very clear, the next from 10 to 20 is architecture overview. From 20 to 30 is data architecture. From 30 to 40 is media. Just so that way we get the other engineers on the team all kind of like arranging their blueprints in like a nice clean way. It also just makes these files are, especially earlier on in the project, where you're going to interact with the most and I'm going to spend the most time with. I do not want to go into /upload/route.js and find the file that deals with .heic versus .jpeg image files. I am going to go in here and I'm going to go into our media storage architecture and I'm going to update the architecture and then I'm going to say to the agent, hey, go update, I just made some changes to our media storage architecture, go update the code to match this architecture. The architecture and these markdown files become the human interface to the code base that exists underneath it, right? Now you still, at this, probably in a year or two from now, you're not even going to need to look at code at all. But for the time being, it does still come in handy from time to time. But ultimately, I will spend sometimes, like for example, we just updated our Glimpse architecture. And it doesn't. And basically, I spent 6 hours of my time writing a blueprint file. Let's talk about like why this is so critical. I am not writing a lot of these files. I am saying, okay, yeah, in the back. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you certainly could. I think what's handy about here is that it's all flat, and I can just look at them all. And I can also tell agents, look in the blueprints directory, and it has all the blueprints. The reason why I have these numbers at the front is because it's super quick to go, whenever you're talking with an agent, you can go at 14, and bam, I get to the blueprint super quickly. Because these are the critical interface in between code and humans, I'm referencing these files vastly more often than I'm referencing files elsewhere in the project. And so this like number underscore thing is certainly something that works really well for us as a team. Also this way, if I'm on a Zoom call or in stand-up and I'm like, I updated blueprint 22, it lets people very quickly know like what's going on there. Yeah. But that's a stylistic decision. The agents don't really care. They should be able to handle whichever approach. By having these very highly detailed blueprint files, you're able to vastly improve the quality of output. Just like before where I was saying it's like, a savant ninth grader. So not only we're giving the agents.md file, that's at the top of every query. And then within that, in the agents.md file, I'm saying, hey, go look at the blueprints file. Go look at the blueprints README, which describes every single blueprint in a one-sentence line, and find the blueprints that are relevant to the query. This is in my agents.amd, right? So agents.amd says, go look at the blueprints. It goes and looks at the blueprints.readme, finds the blueprints that are relevant, goes and reads those relevant blueprints, and then, and only then, actually starts to get into actually thinking about the problem at hand. This increases your token usage by 20% probably, and is absolutely worth it in my opinion. It improves the quality of your output like drastically, right? Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yep. Exactly. And the agent, especially we're in a world of grep-based agents, which is probably more detailed than we want to get into in this class, but basically like now the agents in Cursor or Claude are using a search within your project directory very, very heavily. This is something in the last year that's become like the dominant way for agents to navigate a code base. And so by having these files, when it says, oh, what's the media architecture, it puts a huge amount of weight on blueprints and is likely to pull that up automatically too, right? And so that means that even if it doesn't read it or it misses something, it's very likely that it's going to hit that in its grep and it's going to be like, oh, like how do I work with Git work trees? It's going to search for work tree, it finds this document, it gives it all the context. Yeah, yeah. I do. And this is actually another really good meta thing. We're all about, working effectively with this coworker that is AI. But that does mean that you should be changing some aspects of your workflow to match it. It's not always like forcing the AI to match your workflow. For example, I really disliked README files. Especially old 3.5 and 3.7 would make README files like crazy. And I didn't like it. And I like used agents and I was like, do not write any README files under any circumstance, And it would still occasionally do it. And then I was like, wait, what am I doing? I am trying to make my workflow onto the agent. I switched it around. Now I'm like, yeah, go for it. Make really detailed, highly descriptive README files as much as you want. And then I'm meeting the agent where it's at. And this is really effective. So to answer in on that question, the README is effectively the index, right? And you'll see throughout the project, there's a bunch of README files. A lot of them no human has ever looked at. But it just is giving the agent context on what is this directory? What are the scripts in this directory? How do I interact and what purpose do these scripts serve? All this kind of a thing. Yeah.
I personally really don't like repetitions in README files and many like files and agents.
Yep.
I do a lot of repetitions.
Yep.
I put in agents and same instructions like
Yep.
try principle and
Yep.
MECE principle.
Yep.
Mutually
Mm-hmm.
exclusive
Mm-hmm.
or totally exhaustive. Yeah, like do you do something like that or you
Yeah.
let them like flush tokens?
So we've got a few. So first off, on flushing tokens, like if you're working as a professional software developer, it's my opinion that you've got 5 years left of programming and you shouldn't give two shits about how many tokens you burn. So you should be blasting. You know what I mean? So that just throwing that out there is like a brief note. I think you're hitting on something really interesting there. A core failure mode I see is whenever people have documentation, they build their documentation. Go look at the users table. User table is the following columns. And then a few days later, they might add a new column to their users table and they don't update their documentation. And then a few days later, they say, I want to change the query that inserts someone into users table. And now the agent has two things. And this is what you're hitting on here, right? You've got documentation which is out of alignment with the code. This is your worst case scenario. This is really bad because what's going to happen is it will be immensely frustrating for you, the agent, and your code base, and anyone that ever has to read the code that comes out of that session, because it will thrash in between these two things. So keeping synchronization in between your blueprint or your README and the code base is really important. Oh, hold on one second. So there's one other point that I want to hit on the creating files, is that we have a 3-tiered structure of files that the agent makes. Blueprints is the gold standard. That's where I'm spending my time. That's these files. These are really well refined. If another developer on my team checks in a blueprint, I'm going to look at that line by line, right? I will give feedback. I will human eyes over every single character in my blueprints folder. Then we have the docs folder. As you can see, there's tons of docs in here, right? Let's say like provisioning best practices for our React Native build process. These are files that are not gold standard and are not blueprint, but are things that are useful and should persist across time. And then there's what you're hitting on there, and that is notes. And notes, this is our notes folder, right? And it's gigantic. And these are throwaways. These are temporal. Agent says, and so it says in agents.md, it really lays out this 3-tiered system of documentation. It says, you want to make a note? Put it in notes. Go to town. Build whatever you want. Like, you want to make a bug fix after action markdown file? Because Claude will happily, like, really enjoys doing this. We'll do it totally unprompted, as I'm sure you've seen. Just put it in notes. I used to have this in gitignore. That's a stylistic decision. You could gitignore your notes folder entirely, I think. I ended up finding pretty interesting things, and so we did end up adding them. So as a company, we do. But every once in a while, I just go through, I grab all the files and notes, I compress them into a zip, so that way it doesn't show up in any of the greps, and then like throw it into archive. And it doesn't matter. And so that's a nice way that you're meeting the agent where it wants to work, right? If you use plan mode here, you will notice that plan mode by default will oftentimes want to create a markdown file that says, all right, like, I want to fix this bug in the login screen. You enter into plan mode, you send a query. It's going to make a markdown file. By putting that in notes, you give it to the agent for the purposes of that chat and other chats, other agents in the work tree perhaps, but you don't like clutter up your whole system and you can like clear it off later. Yeah, I think you had your hand up first if you. Yeah.
It sounds like the simple solution there is just to update, human updates the documentation and has agent build it, and then you're not too worried about that. Does that sound right?
In a perfect idealist world, yes, that is the exact solution. But in reality, what happens, I mean, you know, this is a 250,000 lines of code. 4 developers are working on it every single day. There's constantly things changing. So then, I should be running this probably once a week. It actually ends up being more like once a month. I do this query. I want you to go through Blueprint 05 and research all of the code related to Blueprint 05. In any situation that the code is doing something more advanced than the blueprint, I want you to update the blueprint. If you think the blueprint is advocating for an approach that is different than the code and is superior, I want you to list that in a numbered list markdown file named Blueprint 05 code discrepancies. Right there, and then you can actually, you know, have this run through this sequentially. This is super handy, right? What this is saying is, says to the agent, go look at the code, go look at the blueprint. If the code, typically the code for us is better than the blueprint, right? Blueprint started simple. The code said, oh, we discovered some edge case. We've updated for this edge case. You know, it's more cohesive. We fixed some bug, whatever. Then the blueprint's out of date. What this is going to do is say, by default, treat code as standard. Go update the blueprint. Make sure the blueprint stays in sync. But also keep an eye out for the situation where the blueprint might describe something more advanced or different from the actual implementation. Just give me that in a numbered list. And then you can go through that numbered list, and then you can turn those right into Jira tickets or linear tickets or tasks for yourself or whatever. Yeah.
Are you using hooks for that as well?
That's an interesting thing. I've thought about it for sure. I feel like this type of query, any query which I update blueprints, I'm very much in the loop. A lot of these bug fix things, I'm fire and forget. Like if we look at my Warp terminal right now, see all these different tabs. These are all different agents that are all running on different things, right? And I'm not like really keeping a close eye on them. Blueprints I am. So I do think that hooks would be interesting, like making maybe the difference document, but I think I would need to be involved in like any decisions that are being made, because I need to make sure that Blueprints doesn't get overrun with slop. Like Blueprints is super tight, human readable. I'm pretty like in the loop there. Yeah, I do, but hooks is super interesting, and I think that not enough people are using them, and I think myself included. Like, tokens are so cheap, especially for these like Chinese models, that like you should be. I think there's a lot of potential to use hooks to do automated. Every single time I do a good git commit, go kick off a refactor task and give me a report or something like that. It's on the list of things I'd like to explore. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, basically, my first question was answered by then. I think hooks and just prompt injection with Git to double check that stuff is great.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you had any success with like spec-driven development in combination with your blueprints here.
I'm not familiar with spectrum development.
Like spec kit is like there's a lot of different standards that are kind of starting to form that are very much overlapping with what you
Yeah.
set up. And wondering how it's all going to converge, or if everyone's going to have kind of their own flows.
I would say that I've seen some of these, like a lot of people use PRD. You can ask an agent to make a PRD, and that tends to be very effective because it's been trained on like a ton of corporate documents, especially like a concise and focused PRD. Product requirement document is PRD. That's one, and like I sometimes do that, especially if I'm doing like a new project. But ultimately, like these agents are fucking smart, and they tend to pick up on what they need to pick up on. So I'm not sure how much structure is necessarily needed there, but I would be interested if you like, I would love some data on that of like different approaches and actually the impact. Yeah. In the back.
Particularly in a monorepo setup like you have with a couple different apps, do you worry about the AIs being overwhelmed by context?
Not really. And in fact, because generally speaking, so there's some interesting things here. I'm actually going to really get into this on this lab on Thursday of some like pretty advanced context hacking stuff. I would say, so first off, this actually isn't a monorepo, right? We do actually have two separate repos for front end, back end, and it is just this project, right? There's no other like code base or multiple things. I think that can confuse people. That can confuse agents, right? If you have one Git repo that's like attinspersonalprojects.git or whatever, and you have like 5 different games in an academic project, I think then you can really risk doing it. But for something like this, especially with strong agents.md, I think it maintains pretty tight. Yeah. Yeah.
About the blueprint, these things which help like be honest or don't over-engineer, don't under-engineer. Isn't Anthropic already doing this? Like, shouldn't you only say, oh, it's React, and everything else the agent knows, basically?
Yeah, so actually this changes to specificity, right? So a year ago, you had to be like, you're a senior staff engineer at a major technology company, and you're an expert at React Native, and you really value, the following principles, like pick whichever one, right?
Yeah.
That level of specificity is no longer helpful. Now I have been going through and updating a lot of my prompts to be more general, right? Because now the agents are getting much, much smarter. And so you don't want to hem them in. If you say, do a code review, but only look for security weaknesses and duplicate code, which are reasonable things to look for in a code review, you have just like hyper-focused your agent, and they're not going to find all this other bits of feedback. And so in general, over the last year, we've seen this huge trend for less specificity in the actual prompt itself. And I also would add to that, I really enjoy asking the agent to review a prompt and then give me a numbered list of questions about that prompt. And so then you're meeting the 9th grader where they're at, right? Because it knows way more about React Native development than I do. And so I don't know if my prompt is saying, oh, we actually should be using stale Y reuse caching and not the way you've laid it out, which is a more simplistic database-driven caching. And if you can just say, hey, I want this outcome, let's talk about this here in the chat, you're going to enable the intelligence to bubble up from the agent and be like, here's the following 3 options you can think about when you're doing caching. And I can be like, what are the disadvantages of 2 and this kind of thing, and really engage in dialogue. That gets into planning mode, which very recently has become very common. This has to do with like some of the changes to how RL is used to make modern frontier models outside of the scope of this talk. But basically, you should be using planning mode, right? Shift tab is planning mode. You see this change here. Shift tab means you're not going to make any changes to the code base, and you bump the agent into this mode. 6 months ago, you could just say, hey, don't write any code. We're just going to talk about this. I would just say that in a Claude discussion. But now I actually want to use planning mode because Sonnet 4.5 and all of its generation are going through RL processes where that planning mode is on, and they spend 100,000 subjective years of like just planning. And that actually is going to improve the output more, at least in my experience right now, more than saying, hey, we're just in planning mode in the actual query itself. That will probably go away in 6 months, and the agents will be just as good in either. Yeah.
For multi-agent coordination,
Yeah.
what's your kind of working directory tree, especially within Git branches and like pushing code? So
Yeah.
if you have multiple agents working on one feature in one branch, how do you kind of make sure that that's not overwriting what another agent's doing in a different branch?
Totally.
Because you haven't pushed it yet, right? So everything is
Right.
still quite siloed.
Yes. For
Yeah.
sure. So Cursor 2.0 came out 5 days ago while I'm here. Unbelievably good at this specific thing where you actually go in here, you click this, you click work tree, and now this exists in a work tree. This is like, you have to be using this if I mean, this is such an upgrade because it gives you this for free. Before you had to do a lot of like little clever tricks in order to bump different agents into different work trees. Now in Cursor, I can just be like, make a work tree, do it, right? I can also click on use multiple models. Let's say like, find the most interesting file in the project. And I'm gonna say, all right, don't use max mode, use multiple models and kick this off to 3 different agents all in their own work tree, right? And now I have 3 different subchats, all of which that are working independently that I can toggle in between. This is like absolute voodoo magic. It is a substantial step up to my productivity in Claude Code. And as a hardcore Claude Code max user for a year, it is almost frustrating to me that I like built this emotional affinity for a certain tooling, and now I'm like, this is better, and you need to be switching over to this from my perspective.
So that's just isolating that one chat in 3 different instances. However, that's still not managing a different agent.
No, all 3 of these are different agents that are existing in their own work tree. So each one of these agents just got created its own work tree, and they're all working independently of that. And then I can go through and review. You also could give different prompts to different agents, right? Depending on what your goal is.
I guess I mean more so in like Git branches. If you have like a work tree in different Git branches.
No, I mean, if your goal is to have multiple agents, this is how each agent wouldn't interfere with its changes. And you can have the agent make pull requests, or you can manually review. Now, one thing that I also do, touching on multi-agent orchestration, is who here knows what unit tests are? Okay, that's like awesome. That's like a substantial number. I think that's super, super useful. Because we're writing so much code and we're changing so much, unit tests went from like a nice thing that corporate America did 10 years ago to like something that is like effectively, in my opinion, mandatory, even if it's just your solo fun project. I hated when I worked in corporate America writing unit tests, despised them. It was like, it's so much work. It's like all this extra thing. And now I just have the agent write these unit tests. And getting into the multi-agent orchestration, sometimes I'll write some code, okay, one second, and I'll write some code, and then I have an agent in Claude Code Agents called Unit Test Writer. Let's pull it up real quick here. We go into here. I'll get more into actually how to use agents on the Tuesday class because we would be here forever if we really got into it. But what I can do is, this is the agent for writing Jest, which is a very common React Native unit test framework. It says, you are an Jest unit expert. You have mastery. You have testing methodology. And I will say, go create 10 agents. In Claude Code, I will say, go create 10 test writer agents and go, first come up with a plan for all the unit tests we need to write, and then fire off 10 agents at a time to go write all the unit tests. And in that instance, you don't even need worktree, right? Because all of those are independent tasks that I can trust are moving according to this like larger markdown plan. And it's like unbelievably effective. One time I wrote 90,000 lines of code in a single like 4-hour session, right? Like that's fucking crazy. I mean, it is possible that in the year 2000, you might write 90,000 lines of code in like 5 years of work, okay? And it's just like unbelievably effective. Same with if you break a lot of unit tests. I have a similar agent called Unit Test Fixer, where I can just be like, oh shit, we broke 110 unit tests. Super, you know, we've got like 3,500 unit tests on the project right now. Let's say I refactor a major screen, I might break 100 unit tests. I don't want to fucking go in there and figure out what's wrong with all these. I'm going to say, analyze what unit tests are failing in a markdown document, group them together into categories, and then I'm going to look at that, and then I'm going to say, okay, now I want you to fire off 10 unit test fixers at a time based on this plan, and then I can just go and, you know, go do other things. I come back and they're all fixed, right? This is like, I think unit tests uniquely lend themselves to multi-agent orchestration because they don't step on each other's toes in the same way. Generally speaking, I'm actually really only working on maybe 1 or 2 features at a given time. And so you can use work trees, but I actually have just, and I mean, if you want to set up those, that's totally all well and good. I actually just have 2 copies of the code base on my machine, right? So I have main repos and I have secondary repos, and they're identical. And this way I can just pull up, I can have one agent in Claude be in main repos authentic React, and I can have a second agent work on a totally separate thing in secondary repos authentic React. And then they'll just make a pull request against the thing, and I can review the pull request. And you seem confused. No, right behind you. Yeah, no. Yeah. Because it's a very easy way to do this. And this way you avoid the complexity of like, I can just think to myself, so for example, in here, yellow and blue are my main repos, and then I have like red and green will be my secondary repos. And yeah. So the reason why you don't have different branches is because these are all working from the same local directory. So I'm certain we have a whole Git workflow. I'm totally using Git branches. But let's say I want to be adding the login screen, but I also want to fix a bug on the splash screen. This way I can have my main repos might be in login screen. I can have maybe multiple agents working in login screen. And then I can also switch over to my secondary repos, you know, by like, did I go up too far? I did. Engineering, secondary repos. And now I can have a new instance of Claude over here, and it can be doing something totally separate. And then they can merge with git push or pull requests or like whatever the appropriate flow is for your project. I think for like for even anything less than advanced users, I think that this is actually probably the easier and more straightforward way to think about it. But if you want to level up in your Git foo and do some more advanced things, like that's totally a path as well. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. They're in your local Git instance. We will dig more into the class on Thursday. So I would, yeah, because then we'll talk about this. I will just briefly say though that like I know lots of people in here are using Claude Code, and like Composer is really good and way faster, like 10x faster. And there's also like this interesting geopolitical thing of like me using Composer is the first time, like this is a fine-tune. Rumor has it, this is a fine-tune of a Chinese open model, right? And so that's really interesting that I'm here. I effectively have an unlimited budget. Like I'm willing to spend pretty much whatever it takes for the smartest possible coworker, because if it makes me 5% faster, that's like absolutely worth it in real dollar terms. And this is the first time in my entire engineering career that I'm using a fine-tune of a Chinese model to be the most effective engineer I possibly can be. And I think there's like grand geopolitical discussions there that are vastly outside of the scope of this talk. Let's see. So we talked about some blueprint stuff. We should talk about Mermaid. Mermaid is incredible. And I started doing this because of a discussion I had with Patrick at Edge City Esmeralda at a community dinner, and now all authentic engineers have been forced to effectively use mermaid diagrams because they're great. They are an excellent interface in between human-level language and machine code. Unlike Patrick, who, like in the Matrix, probably looks at this and can actually just see this in his mind's eye as a diagram, I have this thing called Markdown Preview Enhanced. I hit Command-Shift-P, I hit Enter, and it's showing up over here. And it turns that into this. So this is so critical because agents have amplified our collective our ability to get so much more work done. And so I can have those blueprints that we were talking about before. Those are long. Those are like anywhere from 200 to 1,500 lines of English. And so if I want to think about, let's do this. This is the storage architecture. Let's pick a good one here. Yeah, so here's like a nice app launch flow for how our storage architecture works. To read this out in English with all the details is not super intuitive. You can do it for sure, but it's like, it's a lot of text. Here I can just be like, oh, what's the flow on app launch? How do we go load cache? How does hydration work? Oh, okay, there's hydration. And this just gives you such a higher fidelity overview of what the sequence of events are. These are both a little, yeah, and so like here's a nice one of how do we handle offline mode in the project. And okay, network detects fails. We can like walk through this state machine. This is both really great for humans, but it's also really great for agents because this is code. And so you can say to the agent, hey, like, go make it. So let's say you're debugging something with the offline mode handling, for example, which is super common, right? That's like, there's a lot of weird complexity in dealing with offline mode in a professional, smooth way. What you want to do is you can say to the agent, hey, I want you to go make me a high detailed mermaid diagram of our offline mode handling. It'll go do that. And then you can go look at that. You could say to another agent, go review this mermaid diagram and make sure that it matches our code just to like really make sure it's accurate. And then you can look through here and you can be like, oh, like maybe this square also is connecting to this square. It'll be much more obvious to you from a systems level what your architecture is than trying to read out, like imagine if all of these is a little paragraph. It's like, this is like multiple pages of text and it'll say, oh, show offline manner and then show back online. Okay, that reads simple. Oh wait, but actually these are in separate flows and the show offline manner shouldn't be connected to back online. It should be the network monitor that fires the back online thing. In a diagram, that's super obvious. In text, it's very much not, especially text where if you're writing thousands of lines of code a day, you're not going to have the same level of fidelity of like back in the day whenever we were able to like, I might just work on one story for a week, right? Now I'm working on multiple stories a day. I'm not going to be able to load all of that into my mental RAM. Instead, this is just so much quicker of like, oh, very quickly, what's the flow? These are all the same. Let's try and find a sequence diagram because I think that's worth seeing as well. I think this is a good one. Invite system, yeah. Yeah, I mean, so this is like a complicated system, right? Of how invites work, how the server checks the status of how invites work, what are the error codes thrown back, and you can just really be like, okay, what's the flow? Oh yeah, here's a sequence diagram. This is actually a little bit dirty. A true sequence diagram should really just be section 1, and section 2 should be a separate thing. But and I talk about this. This is one of these magic words to know, is being like, okay, this is what a sequence diagram is, and it shows the interaction between the user, the user's client, and our server infrastructure. Really, really handy. And if I hit a tricky bug that I can't just one-shot, the login page doesn't work, and I can't just one-shot fix to the login page, I'm going to say, all right, delete your work, go back to the most recent commit. I want you to do a root cause analysis with the mermaid diagram of how to go about doing this. I might ask for a sequence diagram, a state diagram, or a flow diagram, and then I realize, wait, why do I even need to think about this? I'll say create 5 diagrams about how the invite page works. The agent then goes, the agent knows every single possible esoteric type of diagram. It'll pick its favorite 5. It'll make its favorite 5. I'll look at those and I'll delete whichever ones I don't want. And this gets into the meta prompting thing of like, by being if I ask for a sequence diagram, I'm going to get a sequence diagram. If I ask for the best 5 diagrams you can think of to visualize how the login screen works, now I'm using the agent to come up with the best solution there, and I'm learning something of like, oh, I didn't used to use state diagrams very much before this project, and now I'm like, oh, these are really useful, especially for debugging, right? Because like state is a common point of error. That's something you can really use, and so that gets into just like letting the agent make these sorts of decisions. Yeah, totally. Yeah.
It looks like you professional developer a long time,
Yeah.
and I understand. I see you going from down like from lower level of abstraction to upper and upper.
Yes.
When agents start to allow it, yeah, like every
Yes.
3 months, like you can go upper, you feel it. Okay, let's more abstract, then do better job.
You're completely right.
While people who do like white coding and you
Start at the
sometimes
top.
don't have, yeah, they
Yeah.
go from top
Yeah,
down,
yeah.
like okay,
Yes.
just open lovable, tell it what to do.
Yes.
And then only if it cannot fix, go like down.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, actually that last little part, sometimes I am, like now I do exist on a pretty high level pretty often, right? But you're totally hitting on something like, that's the difference to me. Vibe coding is you're starting at the top and you're blasting out huge chunks versus me, I'm actually laying out a lot of architecture, right? And you can switch in between. Like I made a V0 of Authentic, which was not like version 0, not actually V0 the tool, where I actually vibe coded a lot of it, just to be like, all right, what are the main screens? How do the main screens connect between here? Just to like rough shot it. And then I actually had another agent go through the code that was made there and use that to make the basis for the system architecture for V1, and this is actually V2 of the code base.
it was like refactoring and allow you to.
This actually, it wasn't a refactoring as much as it was actually just like, here's a model. We want to make a more professional version of this model. Don't look at any of this code. Like don't take any of this code, but just look at how this code is structured and be like, oh, okay, there's a main screen, there's a home screen, there's an invite screen, there's a bottom tab bar, this kind of stuff. And real quick, I just want to throw in something here. Especially if you're coming from a background in programming, you're used to doing things to save your code. And what I mean by that is like, if there's a bug, you're going to try and fix the bug in the code base. It is hard, but it is easier now, oftentimes, to just throw away whole files and recreate them if you get into tricky bugs. Or like, oh, I worked for 30 minutes on this project, I wrote 2,000 lines of code, but the loading indicator isn't showing up right. And I've tried for a few minutes and I can't get it. It is oftentimes better to just be like, fuck it all, burn all that down, go back to the last git commit, and I'm gonna make a new prompt which says, be sure, like use copy paste my old prompt, but then add at the end, and be sure to think very carefully about exactly how the loading indicator shows up and run that again. And so this is from vibe coders, it's called a reroll, right? And so I think that is something that vibe coding very much gets right, that professional developers are very loath to do, where it's encouraging rerolls on features. And by making a good blueprint, when you re-roll, you've got that blueprint document that you spent all this time building. So you've got like a really high fidelity document that's going to inform that agent. And then I will also say that once I make this blueprint, I will actually spend a little bit refining the prompt for how to actually implement the blueprint. So I'll write the blueprint, and then I will go to Claude and say, I want you to write an expert prompt on how to go about implementing the blueprint for the offline detection, and save that to a markdown file. And then I will go to Codex and say, I want you to review this blueprint and this prompt for implementing this blueprint, and give me a numbered list of things that should be added, changed, clarified, or removed from the prompt, right? You can, and that's existing on this meta level, right? Of like, you're then refining, even the implementation step is now this like expert 1,000-line prompt that really lays out like all the nitty-gritty details. And by saving it to a markdown file and not just saying, I want you to build this, you can then do this iterative development and like really polish the corners. And I watch, especially if you jump in between Opus, Sonnet, Codex, Composer now, you'll see how like a subsequent review of that prompt is gonna be like, oh, you completely didn't think about this one thing. And so that's this like meta level analysis that's going on. Yeah. So I think there's a few things there. First off, I am definitely getting involved in the specific technical decisions of like what architecture we're using, what the layout is using. And a lot of that happens when we're laying out this blueprint file. And a lot of that is also happening when I say, let's say we might make a non-technical blueprint, which describes how the invite screen should work. And then I might say, okay, now you're a user experience designer. I want you to really think about this, think about the user flows, make this blueprint include the invite structure. And then I might say, okay, now you're a senior software, start a new tab, you know, you're a senior software architect, a user experience designer, laid out the following blueprint. I want you to lay out your proposal for the 3 options on how to implement this in terms of general tech stack. I look at those, I think about pros and cons, I think about which one the model suggests. I say, all right, I want to pick this tech stack. Let's lay out a tech stack to do this. And then I'll say, okay, now you're a senior software engineer and you should lay out an implementation plan for how to implement this tech stack for this feature. Oh, no, these are individual prompts. CloudMD exists on a meta level to pass to all of those agents the ability for like where to find certain files or kind of like broad system level things. What this conversation is going to be happening in the terminal or in an agent chat. The most general project-based things would live in agents.amd or cloud.md.
You're just iterating with
Yes.
conversation.
Tons of iteration.
You can't skip that by just like
Well, you can.
having like this giving it meta specific prompts where it preempts those iterations.
I hear you there, and we will get there, and I'm sure in a year or two, we will be much more at that point. But right now, like, I'm still pretty actively involved here, right? Like, at the output of one to the output of the next, it's not like I'm just, like, going to be running these. Like, the way I'm saying it right now, I might be like, I run this prompt, and this prompt, and this prompt. What actually is happening is I'm looking at these files pretty closely and being like, like, I really don't like this. This feels, like, super complicated. We don't need to do this. Or this is too expensive or doesn't fit, whatever my individual decisions are. So there is quite a bit of human in the loop still happening right now. That amount of human in the loop and where the human sits in the loop will continue to decrease, though. I think that's to your point.
Maybe, but even right now, assume it doesn't get that much better. It could be a way to do for you to do it better,
I am sure that there is, but yeah. I would urge caution on there's a balance of over automation, which you can see in a lot of things too. Of like, if you try and script out whole flows, I'm interested in it and I'm curious how your results go. For me, this is like the right balance in between my skill set, my understanding for the agent. Different people are going to come up with different things there, and I'm interested to hear other workflows for sure. Yeah.
Be a step to generating all of your blueprint files? Am I hearing you correctly or no?
It's happening throughout. It's not like, so you're iterating on these prompts. I'm doing this on a bug fix ticket too, where I might be like, the invite screen isn't loading the right invite correctly. Write an expert prompt on how to investigate this behavior. And oftentimes you can also, and I'll get into this on the class Thursday, this is a really great way. I am never, ever compacting a conversation in Claude Code. If my context window starts filling up, I say, we're at 10% context. I want you to write a prompt to go do this next thing, and I'm going to jump into the next thing. I also turn off auto compact, which gives you 20% more space in your context window, which if you're using Claude Code is kind of crazy. I just want to make sure. So what we're talking about there is this meta refinement, right? This constant thing of like creating a document, handing it to the same large language model or a different large language model, and saying, refine this. Think about this. State of automation, that's the specificity stuff. This is, I think, maybe more for people that are leading engineering teams, so I'm going to keep this super brief, but like, there's this very interesting phenomenon if you're leading teams of developers where everybody is using these tools to get linear tickets or whatever, Jira tickets, whatever your task management tickets. They all have MCPs, they all have CLIs, right? So you can be using Jira, you can be using linear. These agents will happily write novels in your task management software about this stuff. And you end up with this like mega slop conversation in between two junior engineers that don't really understand what's going on. And it's just like two different versions of Claude talking into itself and wasting everybody's time. And so being kind of aware, like, yeah, I don't think there's like, that's a whole other topic necessarily, but is an interesting thing here of like still being sure that on some meta level, you understand what's going on. And I think task management is very much that. So our corporate policy is like, it's okay if you want to use Claude or Codex or whatever to make a linear ticket. But like, it is on you that if I asked you a specific detail about any given line in that ticket in stand-up, you need to like know what's going on, right? And if that's not the case, I'm gonna say, hey, I need you to rewrite this ticket to make it more specific so you understand it, whatever, right? And that's a good way to like kind of like walk that balance, I've found. But this is actually like a new challenge to engineering management. But I think I'm gonna like put a pin in that because there's a lot that could be said there. Yeah. 4. I mean, 3 in myself. Yeah. I have about code reviews. Code reviews become huge, right? Because there's so much being written. You know, I used to work in environments where it was like, you were not allowed to ask for a pull review over 500 lines, right? It used to be a very normal thing. And now it's like, we're regularly having 2,000, 5,000 line pull reviews. Now, I mean, not all the time. Most of them are still pretty small. Most are still bug fixes. But I think having really good Git hygiene is super important. And I think automating your code review is the only reason why I'm able to get anything fucking done. Because it's, you know, it used to be like you'd hand an engineer a ticket and you'd be like, okay, it's worth 3 story points, like come back in 4 days and we'll pass it to QA. And now it's like, all right, here's a ticket, like let me get you 2 other tickets so that way you'll be busy all the rest of today. And so that means you need to be really good about your code reviews. And I am pretty pleased with my code review thing, which we're gonna get into with the long promised / commands, which I wanna be sure to touch in this class. But I wanna touch on the magic words. So the important thing here is not to memorize a given prompt. That is a rigid thing. That will help you a little bit and maybe can inspire you, but the goal is not to Chinese room for the AI fans of like, understand that like if someone passes you this symbol, you pass back this symbol. The goal is to be able to speak Chinese. The goal is to be able to speak to the agent. So the goal is to be able to write these prompts in your own style and in your own way. And all of the stuff that I want to be presenting here is to really spark you to be able to be able to prompt in whatever the style works for your technical background, your language preferences, how you like to build. It's going to be different for every person in this room. With that said, there are a few magic words that I do think can be applied pretty liberally across a variety of prompting strategies. These are certainly my favorites. Use best practices. You can't go wrong with. You know, like when would you not want it to use best practices? You know, like I sprinkle that in all the time. It's in our agents.md. I also just throw it in, especially if my query is like a little bit wandery, you know, and I'm like naming a few different things. I'm like, I'd be sure to use best practices to like trying to like bump it back onto the path of like high quality professional output, especially if my query isn't maybe super professional, right? You know, you're a senior engineer, that's good. This one I recently came up with and it's fantastic. And it's for code reviews, but I mean, you can use it in general, which is you are a senior engineer reviewing the work of a junior developer who created X. X could be a markdown file, X could be a whole Git branch, could be a PR, doesn't matter. It's fantastic because it says, this is good work and I can do better. And it frames it in this professional way. And also the tone, like, also this gets into the engineering management thing, but like the tone matters, right? Like if I give feedback to a junior engineer on the team and it's like, there are a number of critical errors in this code base and it is like clearly not good, that's like not great, right? We want there to be that professional tone of like, you know, there's the following strengths in the following code and there's the following weaknesses and we propose the following remediation plan to update the following weaknesses. That's gonna like go over much better. It's gonna keep the team more cohesive. I do this to my own work. I will tell Claude that I'm the junior developer that just submitted the thing and have it be the senior developer and give me feedback. It's like remarkably good. And then this one, I've talked with other members of the secret engineering group chat about this one, but and give deep feedback as a detailed numbered list of things to add, change, clarify, remove. This is super useful. This is the one that, like, if you're going to memorize one of these, like, this is fucking fantastic, because what's going on here is, like, let's say I hand it a 2,000 line code change, right, across 20 files. I don't want a whole, you know, like, wandering essay of Markdown about the various strengths and weaknesses that I have to type out. Instead, I do this, and then I read that feedback, and I'm like, 1, accept, 2, accept, 3, skip, 4, I like that idea, but we're not going to implement it now. Make a linear ticket to do this in a future revision. 5, implement. 6, implement. Okay, go. And I just, that just, like, vastly increased my productivity, right? And oftentimes, I'm actually like, I agree with all of your suggestions except for 8 and 17. Skip those 2. Like, it's a huge force multiplier. And it doesn't matter if you're working on code or you're writing a poem. Like, this idea of I like, and give your feedback as a detailed numbered list of things to add, change, clarify, remove. It's like, all right, what do we want to add? What things in here are inappropriate? What things in here just need clarification? And what things need removed? This is like so often what you're trying to get out of the agent. And then I already mentioned using planning mode. Because of the RL environments that the current models are trained on, planning mode is worth using. Don't just say, don't write any code right now. Actually kick the agent into whatever its industry-specific planning mode is, at least until you get good at that. And then, like, once you've learned the rules, then you can discard the rules if, like, you feel so inclined. And then I mentioned the diagram, like, knowing what a sequence diagram and a state diagram, particularly maybe an interaction diagram, is good. But just tell the agent, go make a bunch of diagrams. You don't even need to worry about what these specific things are. If you are, like, doing this professionally, though, I think it probably would be worth looking up the Wikipedia article of this while the agent goes and, like, makes the actual diagrams. And then this is technically an hour-and-a-half class. This is the last major thing I want to touch on, is the / command. And particularly, I am uniquely proud of our code review / command, which is huge if you're working. So code reviews, for the independent developers here, right? Like, you're working in Git, you get something done, you're going to open a code review, which says, hey, I got this work done, and I want another engineer to review my work, right? And let's go see. I don't actually know. Let's see, git.com. Let's see if we have any. We actually might not have any open pull. We have no open pull requests on our client. Well, we don't have any open pull requests because I've been doing a good job. But basically, it shows up in here, and it's just like, hey, here's the change. There's following number of lines changed, following number of files changed. This is actually going to be, I strongly suspect, how even individual projects work. This used to be something that only mattered to distributed teams. Would only matter once you were working on a team of engineers. Your individual project, you would just do git push, right? But now agents make these pull requests, and pull requests become the way that you're going to be reviewing what the agent does in its own world. And what's great about this, let's go into, actually, come again? I think so. I actually never, no, that's a good idea. I never look at closed pull requests. This is done work. What's a fun, I mean, there's a million possible things. How about this one? So here was a pull request. You can see it was like 2,000 lines were added, 400 lines were taken away. You should get familiar with this. This is just like Git standard stuff, but it's like worth being familiar with. So whenever a team member opens one of these pull requests, I'm going to go in here. I'm going to look at what changed, particularly in the actual source code, maybe a little bit less the tests. And it's like, all right, you know, I'm gonna take a glance through this, see what's going on, right? You're gonna want to be able to do this for agents. What's the current paradigm, which probably is not going to be forever, but right now is that if you have some of these cloud agents, what they're gonna do is you're gonna say, go fix this bug. They go off, they fix this bug, they create a PR, a pull request, and then this is where you are gonna review whatever that agent did, and be sure that it like matches what your needs are. However, as these get huge, especially if you're coming without as much code background, right? There's a lot of stuff going on here, right? And like, you might not understand what these files are necessarily. For me, I am using a slash command. We'll use that specific one. So what I'm going to do is let's switch to here. So I'm going to go to Claude. I'm going to say get fetch. I'm going to say get checkout here. We've already deleted this branch, I guess. But basically, once we're in a branch, we can actually just run this here. I go slash, I hit code review. This is my most recent one, October 30th. You can see how often I'm updating this, right? And I hit enter. And then I go do whatever else I want to do in my day. And while this is running, I'm going to show you what the command is. And this is some pretty voodoo magic. What happens here is, you see I'm doing that trick I told you with the junior and senior engineer. Giving feedback, it's critical to do these phases. It checks to make, and some of this might not apply to you. This is very much a professional level project, but phase 2 particularly will, right? So for phase 0 is make sure you're on the right branch, make sure the branch is updated, right? Because like, what if the person pushed some code later and isn't in my local directory? Make sure it's up to date. Look for previous reviews. This is super handy because a lot of times if you're doing a big thing, there might be multiple reviews. Find a previous review, but do not read it. Just be aware that it exists and version this review appropriately. Understand the branch. And by the way, I used Claude to help create this, right? I said, okay, I need you, and I watched how Claude would do a code review, and I kind of formalized it, right? Of, okay, understand the branch. What changes happened in this branch of code? A pull request is just about one chunk of changes. Really understand all the files that changed. Understand only on this branch. If you do not have this line, it will be like, I have opinions about your code base, and I will use this opportunity to share them with you. And sometimes that's interesting, but generally speaking, that's not what you want. Your goal is to be like, within this chunk of work, what's happening? This is run the unit test, run the linter, run our type check, make sure that everything's solid, give me a really clear list of what's going on. That I will chide a developer that gives me any pull request that doesn't pass these by default, but I just want to be very sure that that's the case. Then, and this is my recent change, understand the changes in the branch. It now has in its context thousands of tokens of what happened in this branch, of what was loaded, what was removed. Now I want you to come up with a clear understanding, oftentimes make a mermaid diagram or numbered list that lays out sequence of events, what changes. This is super helpful because again, I'm reviewing 5 to 10 pull requests a day, right? So I might not know the details of what the login screen bug is. This is going to say, okay, this is a login screen bug fix. It edits the login screen test, and it also updates the API call for user authentication in the authentication helper functions, right? So I'm like, okay, it loads me with context of how can I assess what this code is. And whenever I run this, I'm going to know, hey, the authentication code got changed here. I should be sure to make sure that logout works still and stuff like that. Output this to the console. Then create an actual markdown file with a consistent name structure of what this looks like. I actually repeat this because I want it to be very clear. Okay, now it's time to actually create your initial PR. It spent thousands of tokens. Like this will burn, 80% of a Claude, well, maybe like 60% of a Claude Code million token window doing this code review. And that's what I want. What? I mean, it's going to depend a lot on the complexity, right? If it's 2 lines, it won't be, but it's a ton. It's like, generally speaking, I'm just going to use this chat for code review. And then on the feedback items, I will say, I agree with items. Let's look at one. Let's see what it came up with. Let's just look at a pre-made one here. So down here in notes, you see there's a bazillion bits of feedback, right? So it says, all right, like this branch updates the story ring functionality. Instagram has rings around the profile photo. That's what this is on Authentic. Well implemented. Okay, so it sorts them into categories of blockers, importance, and potentials. And the biggest human in the loop change that you want to do is that oftentimes things that it thinks are blockers aren't actually blockers, right? And that's where that is where I am using my professional knowledge to iterate on the feedback, right? Here it's like important things that should fix. It's missing JS doc documentation. It's using inline styles. One of the steps in the code review, so yeah, blockers, whatever, is the validation pass. This is probably something I don't see a lot of and is super handy. It comes up with this document, it writes all these lists, and then it gets into phase 5. For every single one of these items, go research it and make sure it's real. This knocks out probably 33% of the stuff it finds, because this is complicated code, right? Like, you have some error somewhere, some niche function that isn't working. By having this validation pass, it's going to be like, oh, I think I found an error with the authentication function with logout. This phase 5 says, go use your agent and narrow in on authentication and logout specifically and validate if this is an issue or not. And then also give it options of like, okay, you can confirm it, you can remove it, you can downgrade it, you can ask a question if you're like not sure about something. Yeah. You know, it almost never uses it. Yes, though, it does. But generally speaking, this is about the code that's there. Like, it doesn't need to learn about React Native. It's expert at React Native. So there's not a lot of external code, not a lot of external web calls that happen. If you were working on a project, let's say you're working on like a DeFi project and using a lot of different frameworks. Also, I should very much say this, I am able to automate much more than most projects because we are in the center of the training distribution. And what I mean by that is by using React Native and JavaScript and Vercel, this is like extremely well documented industry standard stuff. This means the agents are better. If you were working in Go and Rust on a DNA recombining, whatever, lab, you are not going to be able to get this level of automation. You will need to be more involved still. And I am very intentionally steering all my projects to the center of that training distribution. So by default, you need to have a damn good reason to use anything, in my opinion, subjectively, besides Python, JavaScript, like standards, right? Industry standards, center of the road stuff. You think of like C or if you say the name of the programming language and people don't immediately know what it is and college textbooks weren't written on that thing, I would strongly advise making other architectural decisions. Obviously, sometimes that's out of our hands. Yeah. 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 Yes. Absolutely. So I'm going to answer that in a general sense of like, how do you work with esoteric languages? Solidity certainly being one, right? Not a lot of college textbooks were written on Solidity, and it's changing very quickly, right? Which actually is even worse, because then the training data is polluted with like the old versions, the newer versions. And for that, to me, it's about context engineering. And so like, I would take your favorite Solidity projects, and in my agents.md, I would say, I want you to follow the conventions here. You might even link to a Git repo. I know Patrick does that here, where he will literally be like, here's a whole Git repo. Here's the complete project. We want you to be following the techniques that are laid out here. Include style manuals. I know I helped a corporate client do this vastly overnight. Like their whole engineering team's like bitchy and moany about how bad these agents are. And I'm like, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take your entire in-house style manual for this project, and we're going to include it in the context window of every single query you send. Like, I can't even quantify how much of an improvement that makes instantly, right? And okay, your context window is smaller, but like it doesn't fucking matter, So I would assume you'd be able to do something like that, of like getting your documentation and just jamming it into context. And I'll talk about this on the Thursday thing, but if you're in Claude here, you can do this context command, which is like underrated. And this gives you a visual depiction of what your context was used for. This is really, really useful for understanding what got spent where, right? So my system prompt, which is some stuff from Anthropic and some stuff of my agents.md, right? That's like 1% of my however many, 100,000 tokens or this is a 200,000 token window in this specific model, right? So like this lets you be like, oh, this is totally worth it. You know, I'd rather just have a few more chats. I can jam in whole manuals into here, especially if you format that in Markdown. And like what your customs agents are. If you use MCPs a lot, you will watch them consume huge amounts of this context space. I actually don't use any MCPs at all at this point. I'm only using command line interfaces. There are different styles. Some people may do different things there, but I just like will briefly slip that in. And I'll just finish out on the code review thing here as we're wrapping up. Then it says, so when it's doing this code review, it's doing this validation pass, and then it's comparing against previous reviews, and it's looking at the previous review, and it's giving me feedback on what items the engineer resolved from the previous round, right? And this is just like incredibly useful. And so you see here, here's this detailed numbered list. And so I get to the end of this prompt and I can, you know, it says, okay, you know, this is all done. Here's all this feedback. I just hop into Super Whisper and I say, so, you know, I would be in Claude to do this, but I'll just do it right here. Thanks for the review. Let's address items 1, 3, and 7. Let's do this by writing a expert prompt that's a few hundred lines at most that will describe how to solve the issues here using best practices. We don't want to worry about any of the other items except for the ones I mentioned, right? Then we take this, it outputs a new markdown file of a prompt. I copy that prompt, I paste it into a new chat, then I have a full fresh context window. And this is important because right now there's like effectively buggy code on how to use the auth function in the context window that was looked at multiple times by the reviewing agent. You do not want to fix the context window. You do not want to fix the auth code in that context window because you've got all these tokens that are like almost right but are wrong. That's the worst type of token. What you want to do is you want to say, hey, I'm going to open up a new context window. I'm going to make a new chat with Claude. I'm going to take this expert prompt that says, this is what the issue is. Here's where the code is. Here's the issues we're fixing. You know, here's probably the related files. And then have that happen in its own thread. And then if you want, after you've done that, you can hop back to your main review thread and be like, confirm that issue 7 is resolved. Oftentimes at this point, I don't even do that because it's like that effective, right? And then you can just run code review again after that, right? And so you can just keep hammering this command and it will just keep giving you these like very detailed lists of feedback. All right, so we're just about out of time here. I will just briefly plug, so if you're like, oh, this is super interesting and I wonder what this will look like, a more hands-on approach will be like this concept of a lab. We'll do it here on Thursday, same time, same place, where we'll be like, oh, we're gonna actually go through what does this meta prompting look like, a little more open-ended as well. I think that probably like 50% or more of this content will be in that class, but I think a lot of this is good. And if you're like, what does this actually look like to do and iterate on? Because I feel like that was a lot of the feedback I got before of like, okay, this is really good stuff, but to really embed this into your workflow, I feel like seeing someone actually do a real thing is like invaluable. I think we probably have time for another quick question or two. I don't see anyone coming in the back. Your hand was right behind you, up first.
That you have a large code base.
Yeah.
Have you ever tried just generate the whole thing from blueprints?
There is a part of me that would love to take a weekend to try that. I think it would be very interesting. And you could even go further. So what you're saying is like a major refactor, right? Like,
Well, more like trying.
yeah.
Not refactor, just reproducing.
Yeah. So what you can do is you can say we have a V2 of this project and we're going to create a V3. And then you can tell the agent, you can go look at the V2 project and like the best sort of documentation is code, right? I think it'd be really interesting. I have done that on small personal projects that are like, whatever, less than 50,000 lines of code. I've never done it on a project this big. I think it would be very interesting. A smaller project works great. Yeah, for sure. Because the code is the best sort of documentation, right? So if you're like, oh, I built this like web tool that tells you time zones and different things, but I want to fix some fundamental architecture issues. Because that happens a lot, right? You're working on a personal project, you realize you made a bad decision early on, you didn't realize it until you built out the functionality, then you're like, oh, I want to change the architecture to fix this. What you can do is be like, okay, I want you to evaluate this project, but with keeping in mind this major architectural change. And you'll watch the agent jump to the old version and like right there. But I would encourage doing it for sure. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and Composer. Well, you know, we're taking some space. You know, it's a little tense, and I don't want to like go on the record necessarily, but you know, I'm still paying them $200 a month, but I don't think I will continue. I think I'll probably bump down plans at least. I mean, I just want to say though, like I am immensely proud of my Claude Code score, of like. It's like such a good thing. If you can get yourself to think the video game here is being actually productive in this like coding thing and not like leveling up in a, you know, it's a really great mind hack to get yourself to be more productive. My record was I had, this was in the old era whenever Opus was much more accessible. I spent like $2,000 worth of API credits in a month. And I'm paying $200, so you feel like you're like really beating the system. But we all have different solutions there, and these things are going to go back and forth, and that's why it's just like aggressively evaluating your tech stack is the thing I'd like to encourage. Yeah.
You touched upon this a few times, but how do you make sure that the LLM is not touching the code that you don't want it to? So I mean, there could be multiple solutions to a single problem, but as an engineer, I would prefer a decoupled solution where the changes are localized.
Definitely.
I mean, you touched upon it a few times, but I don't quite get the exact sharp knife that I'm looking for. Yeah.
I mean, well, one is the pull review. When, you know, right, like whenever I'm passing this work off to another engineer, I might look at that and then they're gonna look at that and be like, oh, you were working on the login screen, but you just touched code that's like obviously wrong. That's one place to catch it. Another place is being, I mean, the agents are pretty good too. 3.5, you know, a year ago we were on Sonnet 3.5. That was, I think, more of a thing where it would be like, oh, and like, we should probably just refactor this whole code. This is kind of messy, and it'll just go off and do it thinking it's a helpful, harmless assistant, but it's really like making a mess of some completely unrelated feature. That's also why in the code review, I have this critical line of just like, you're only working here. I generally have less of an issue with that, but I think, and this is the meta learning of like, okay, this is one of your observations that you're regularly having, add that into your agent's MD file of like, confirm with me the scope of the change you want to make, or use the smallest scope possible. I mean, I would be hesitant on use the smallest scope possible of just like, we favor, you know, the most effective minimal disruptions to the overall architecture flow as a whole, or something like that. Just being careful to not, I mean, if you tell it make the smallest possible change, it'll be like, oh, okay, like I'm gonna come up with this like god-awful like single line thing that uses a bunch of ternary operations to like voodoo fix whatever this issue is. And so it's just, you need to be, if you're noticing that, agents on MD is the thing, and just being subtle about how hard you try and push it, because you want to still let it have some freedom of will, is kind of my impulse there. Yeah, totally. Any other questions? I think we're 4 minutes over now, so I think great success. Yeah, I hope that this was helpful for folks. And if you're interested in this and want to see it in practice, we'll do that on Thursday. Yeah, thanks.